Kia ora koutou. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming along. Can you hear me? Thanks for being part of the 5th WOW Annual Summit. WOW is a registered charitable trust, not for profit. It's run by a dedicated group of individuals. Our aim is to educate, inspire and enable New Zealand communities to accelerate towards a low emissions, regenerative future and then go beyond that and live a wonderful life, I hope. But in particular for the generations to come. I'm Geoffrey Tompkins. I'm on the WOW board. I'm here mainly to introduce the session, but also to enjoy it. Just a few housekeeping issues to start with. The emergency exits are fairly clearly marked there. You go out through that door and then out onto the terrace, or else you go out that way. There's also a door out the back there. The toilets are out in the off to the side of the main entrance on the left as you come into the entrance. If there's an emergency, I think we're supposed to meet down by Spates Ale House as the gathering place. And I think that's just about it. Today's session, Climate Action in the Rural Sector. It's an open lecture to explain greenhouse gas emissions in the agricultural sector, the emissions trading scheme, and the current understanding of the land sector emissions levy and removals in the latest He Waka Eke Noa report. Welcome. Our presenter today is Carly Green. She started a company, EAS, Environmental Accounting Services, some 15 years ago to help progress international development and the impact of climate change. Carly is also a member of the board of WOW, and I think I'll leave it at that and hand you over to Carly. Sounds quite a technical session, but I think I'm going to enjoy it.
I'll make it easy, Jeff. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. As Jeff said, my name's Carly Green. I live at Lake Hawea. I've lived there for the last 13 or 14 years with my family. And we also run our business from there, Environmental Accounting Services, and there's a few of our staff in the room. So, yeah, it's great to be here this morning. As Jeff said, I've actually got around 20 years' experience in greenhouse gas accounting for the land and, agriculture and forestry sector. I started it predominantly during my PhD, which was completed in Ireland just as my second child was born. So I guess that's where most of my knowledge foundation has come from. Today, though, we're talking. Well, actually, before I get stuck into that, as member of the board of WOW, we'd just like to acknowledge the pollination partners for the summit this year, our fifth summit. We're super appreciative of the financial support of all of the sponsors that are listed here. Today, the presentation, I'm going to go through the presentation and then there's an opportunity to ask questions. And the way we're going to do that is because we're actually live streaming this event. If you don't have the mic, the people on the live stream can't hear. So the way we can monitor, make the question and answer session as effective as possible, we're going to use this app called Menti. So if you've got your phone, just search menti.com and then you enter in this code and then you can write your questions in there and then I can answer them. That's the way we're going to manage the Q&A session today. So this code and website, I think, will appear as the presentation goes on. So you've got multiple chances to ask the questions through that platform. Okay, so yeah, as I said, I'm Carly, a little more wrinkly than that photo, but not too much. So. I guess a little bit about who we are. So EAS, as I said, was founded around nearly 17 years ago now. We work predominantly globally, actually, from Lake Hawea, and more recently, more locally around New Zealand. So we work with a range of different organisations, from governments right down to individuals. And you'll probably notice a few familiar logos there from local work we do around the QLDC region. And yeah, we're just a group of really passionate people about communicating and communicating around climate change mitigation, and then also supporting other like-minded individuals and organisations to make change. Yeah, so really how we describe ourselves is that we're accessible, reputable and pretty friendly group of people who try to take hard questions and make them easier to understand. And I'm hoping that's what I can try and do today. So this will be a very apolitical conversation, really just about what the government is proposing for the ag sector, what that might mean. We've got some practical examples of what that means for some landowners in the region, and then also what's happening globally. So what are other organisations, governments doing in the ag sector related to greenhouse gas mitigation? So yeah, that's the intent of today's session. So before we start though, I wanted to sort of just take us back a little bit, set some sort of foundational information so that we can then progress through the rest of the technical detail. So we're going to do a little bit of homework first up. Sorry about that. I know sometimes I break out in a bit of a cold sweat when someone says homework, but I promise it won't be that hard. So what is a greenhouse gas and what does it have to do with me? Okay, so it's a common question we get from people in this sector. So I guess it's also good to just reflect on what we mean by when we're talking about greenhouse gases. So effectively a greenhouse gas is a gas that is really, really effective at absorbing infrared radiation. So what that means is when the sunlight penetrates the atmosphere, these gases absorb this heat, and then they also are very effective at holding on to that heat. So that's what actually heats the atmosphere. And the more and more greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere, the warmer and warmer it gets. So it's kind of like at the moment where the atmosphere is wearing a winter duvet pretty much all year round now. Rather than stripping it off for a summer duvet, we're stuck with this winter duvet. So that's kind of what greenhouse gases do in the atmosphere. When we talk about greenhouse gases, what we're really talking about, particularly in the ag sector, are three main gases. One is CO2, the other is methane, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide. They're the three gases that we refer to when we're talking about greenhouse gases. There are other gases, but they don't originate predominantly from the ag sector, so we're not going to really talk about those today. The main one we're going to talk about is methane. That's the main, the predominant gas from the ag sector that is contributing to this sort of winter duvet we're experiencing. Just a little bit on terminology. When we talk about greenhouse gases, you'll also hear about carbon. So we kind of shorthand greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide to carbon. So everything gets referred to in terms of carbon. So the reason why that is it's just, I think we're a little bit lazy. We don't like technical terms, and carbon's heaps easier to say than carbon dioxide equivalent. So when we are talking about these gases, we are talking in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So carbon is a part of that, but it's not actually, it's an element, it's not a gas. It's a shorthand for carbon dioxide equivalent. So when people use that term, they are actually referring to carbon dioxide equivalents, not carbon itself. So why are we actually here talking about this? Well, this is a graph that's from this really interesting and useful actually website called Climate Action Tracker. So this particular update is a 2021 update. This website tracks how we're progressing towards basically our Paris target. So everyone's heard of the Paris target, I guess. That's why we're really here. These policies are coming from that particular global agreement. So this is a graph. You'll see timeline on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we've got this greenhouse gas emissions, and this is in gigatons of CO2 equivalents. Too many coffees this morning with that laser, I'll stop doing that. So basically we've got a timeline here from 1990. 1990 is a key year in international policy, that's why it's there, no other reason. And we've got this black line which is based on real data. So the black line, if you think about it, that's actual data, that's emissions, actual emissions that have happened. And then all the other lines are predictions or hopeful scenarios, and some of them are probably more like reality scenarios. So these are the different projected warming by 2100. So this comes from a number of models around what each country collaboratively has committed to through the Paris Agreement to try and reach what we're aiming for is 1.5 degrees warming, which is this green line, okay? So some of you may have seen this before. So basically we're here, and the policies to get to 1.5 degrees warming by 2100, we really have to just jump off this cliff now to reduce emissions. Okay, so that's what we're hoping for. What's reality sort of sitting at the moment? Policies and actions from countries, we're more in this blue line, so heading out towards 2.5 to 3 degrees warming. This is a global number, okay? So this will be what the globe experiences, not what each individual country or region experiences. So you've got to think about it as a global warming. So most of the policies that countries are putting in place fit in this blue band, and that's where the two key policies of New Zealand I'm going to talk about are the emissions trading scheme and the emerging He Waka Eke Noa partnership framework. Yeah, so that's kind of where we are. So yeah, I won't dwell on that. Okay, so in terms of what that means for New Zealand, I thought this infographic was quite a nice representation for the ag sector, and thanks to Felicity, my colleague, for finding this, adding it to the slide deck. So if you look here, we're down in this region. This infographic gives some details about what we can expect in terms of projected impacts in climate for the ag sector. So the blue clouds mean that it's going to be wetter down our region. So we're likely to experience increased winter and spring rains. So the precipitation will fall as water rather than snow predominantly. So we've got lots more precipitation down this region as rainfall. The little guy here looks a little nasty. So this is like basically representing change in pests and diseases in this area as well, and that's predominantly because the climate, basically it's going to get warmer and wetter. Down here in the southern regions, this little graph here is related to increased annual pasture production, again possibly because of the warmer temperatures and rainfall. And then the last one, sort of in this region here as well, is increased drought severity in most areas. So in this particular region here, you'll see some more drought risk. It's that they're the main sort of changes we can experience, we're likely to experience in the South Island. It looks a little more red up in this zone. So in the North Island, they're going to experience less rain. There's less rainfall, less blue clouds here, that's for sure. More drier, sort of sunnier days, over 25 degrees. So it's going to get warmer and drier, and that'll lead to more heat stress for animals in this region and drought. So yeah, so different parts of New Zealand are going to have very, very different impacts as a result of that warming that I spoke about in the previous slide. So where do those emissions come from in New Zealand, and why is there so much focus on the ag sector at the moment? Well, basically, New Zealand has quite a unique greenhouse gas profile compared to other countries, and that's mainly because we have such a very clean, renewable energy, like stationary energy sector. Most of our electricity is being generated by renewable energy, so our emission factor for electricity is really low. If you compare that to, say, Australia, our emissions factor for New Zealand for electricity is 0.1 tonnes per kilograms per kilowatt hour. In Australia, it's 10 times that. It's 1.1. Well, yeah, it's nearly more than 10 times. So energy, the stationary energy sector in electricity generation in New Zealand is very small. It's 5.1%. If you compare that to Australia or the US or Europe even, you know, that electricity sector is anywhere between 30 and 40% of their emissions come from electricity generation. What that means in a percentage term then, agriculture becomes a bigger part of the pie because other sectors are greener here in New Zealand. So it's not because New Zealand agriculture is any more greenhouse gas intensive than any other country. It's simply because the other parts of our economy are less energy intensive and less fossil fuel intensive. So around 42% comes from what we class as energy in this greenhouse gas accounting framework, and this is a global greenhouse gas accounting framework. And the predominant feature there is transport. So 20% of our emissions come from transport in the energy sector. So half of our energy sector emissions are coming from transport. And then nearly 50% of New Zealand's emissions come from the ag sector. 48.1% come from the ag sector. And the predominant gas here is methane. So they're coming from livestock in this space. Yeah, so I guess the key message here is that the New Zealand's profile is quite unique. So the closest national profile would be Ireland. Ireland has a similar in terms of ag, but their ag sector is still only about 30% of their total pie. So that's quite unique. And then the second part to take from this is that this sector here is all covered by the emissions trading scheme. So how the government has tried to mitigate emissions from this sector is by including all of those areas into the ETS. And then the He Waka Eke Noa policy, rather than throw agriculture also into the ETS, there was a partnership to try and work out what's the best pricing mechanism for agriculture to make change, and that's what this policy now is going to reflect. This remaining 48% of our emissions will fall under this, basically is covered by this partnership framework, He Waka Eke Noa. So if we break that 48% down a little bit more, what does it actually look like in the ag sector? So enteric fermentation, which is how livestock digest feed, that is the main source of emissions. So they're basically the process of digesting feed produces methane because they don't have stomachs like ours. They have they're ruminants. They don't have an acid stomach like us. So they use methanogens or basically to break down the feed. So if we break that down a little bit more into more detail, what livestock are actually producing most of the emissions, so 48% is coming from dairy cattle, 28% from sheep, and then non-dairy cattle 20%, and then deer a much smaller proportion at just over 1.5%, 1.7%. So that's the main source of methane in New Zealand. We also, as I said at the start, agriculture also produces other gases like nitrous oxide. And so those nitrous oxide emissions also come from livestock, because when they deposit urine and dung out on the fields, that also leads to nitrous oxide release. But also, nitrous oxide comes from application of nitrogen fertilisers as well. So when we do the accounting, we look at the methane from the livestock, as well as the nitrous oxide from the livestock and any additional fertiliser being applied to the paddocks. And if you basically add those up, then you've pretty much got your account. So you can see there's very few data points needed to get a really reasonable estimate of greenhouse gas emissions on farm. You need stock numbers, tons of fertiliser applied, and pretty much then you've got an account. A little bit about how you manage that land, but that can also impact the total number, but yeah, the number of data points is pretty small. So what are we doing about this? So in New Zealand, we, as a collective nation, have put forward, or the government has put forward, a commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to now 50% below a 2005 baseline. So again, these dates are set, in the international negotiations, trying to make reporting consistent between countries so we can make comparisons about how countries are going. So New Zealand have set 2005. A few countries have got a different baseline, but most countries have set 2005 as the baseline date now. So we've committed to 50% reduction by 2030. I don't know how many fingers you've got, but That's less than 2 hands of fingers, right, left to go in terms of years. So we've got to try and halve our emissions in the next 7 years. If you remember that first graph I showed around our actual numbers, we've been working as a collective, not full collective, but globally a lot of countries have been trying to reduce emissions, and we've continually been going up. So this is not a small task. It's quite a big one. Most countries have a similar target. So they slightly vary, but most countries have made the same sort of commitment to the Paris Agreement, somewhere between 40 and 50% reductions from a 2005 baseline or a 2006 baseline, but in and around the same amount of commitment. So it's not just New Zealand making these commitments, we're pretty much consistent with most other countries. And if you actually go back and look at climate change tracker that I talked about, New Zealand looks pretty bad. Like, we're basically not meeting those commitments. The way that it's being reported, like basically it looks like we're doing our best, but most countries are trying to do their best, but we're really going to struggle to hit those targets by 2030, not just New Zealand, everybody. So that's why we're feeling a lot of pressure at the moment, a lot of discussion, a lot of movement, because we really are running out of time. We have to start doing something. So on top of that, New Zealand also has a zero carbon position as well. So this is a national policy. This is not necessarily specifically towards our Paris target, but it's going to support the ability to meet the Paris target. So this net zero, there's so many terminology. Zero carbon, I'm going to be very specific here because that net zero means something else. Zero carbon bill. This doesn't include biogenic methane. So this particular target will be predominantly met from the energy sector, from non-methane emissions. So New Zealand will probably meet the zero carbon bill because they're going to move out methane from that bill. Okay, so it's not part of the accounting. And we're hoping to reach that by 2050. So there's another, basically that's a longer term commitment or target that New Zealand are trying to hit. And then because biogenic methane is not part of that zero carbon amendment, there's a separate policy to manage methane. So we've pulled out a separate target for biogenic methane, and that is to reduce emissions to somewhere between 24 and 47 by 2050 and achieve a 10% reduction by 2030. So that 10% reduction by 2030 is predominantly what the He Waka Eke Noa framework has been focusing on to try and hit, with the intention that, and why this is quite a large, range, either 24 to 47, and that's because achieving this really is going to rely on technology to come into the ag sector to try and mitigate those emissions. And we're going to talk about what's coming and what's available now in a minute. So that's why the range is so large, because that silver bullet or that technology isn't actually in place right now. So it'll depend on what happens in the research and development phase and how quickly and effectively and useful that will be in actually being able to take it up on farm. So that's why the range is there. So predominantly now we're looking at here, we're aiming to try and achieve a 10% reduction in methane by 2030. So around 1.5% now per year out to 2030 is what the policy frame is actually being set up to try and achieve. So how we do this in New Zealand to achieve all of those three elements is there's the main mechanism we're using is the emissions trading scheme. Most countries who are trying to meet Paris targets at the moment have emissions trading schemes. There's many. I can't remember the last number of countries, but it's well over the 30 countries at the moment have an active operational emissions trading scheme. Pretty similar to how New Zealand run theirs. It's a simple, relatively simple process where you've got industry who emit CO2 or CO2 equivalents, and they have to surrender for every tonne of emissions that they emit. They have to surrender what's called a New Zealand unit. So they have to surrender these to the government to basically, basically account for their emissions. And the way they do that is they basically buy NZUs, and the place where you can buy NZUs at the moment is from sink-related projects, predominantly in pine plantations in New Zealand, and that's how you basically that's how the emissions trading scheme's operating. So this company either pays for an NZU, or it uses that money to reduce its NZUs internally. So once a price of an NZU, say in a pine plantation, gets to a certain level, it might be cheaper for that business to do some changes to their operations to try and reduce their emissions. And that's the intent, that the businesses can, credits shouldn't be so cheap that it avoid it. They should be at a level where it becomes cheaper to actually make change in your business rather than go to the market and buy an offset. And we're almost getting to that tipping point. The modelling shows that once the credits hit around $100 a tonne, people start to feel the pain and find internal changes to make a difference. At $5 a tonne, that's not going to work. And that's what's basically that's clear. So basically, we're getting to a point now in New Zealand where at 86 or 90, I haven't looked at the spot price today. That makes sense for someone to do something about reducing their emissions, which is what we want, right? We need to reduce emissions. We need to jump off the cliff. Yeah, it's not so bad down there. Okay, so agriculture's outside this scheme. I mentioned that earlier. And so the government had intended to either bring agriculture into this trading scheme as an emitter, or basically come up with an alternative. And so He Waka Eke Noa, which is the partnership between industry and the government, has been trying to work out an alternative to bringing in agriculture into the emissions trading scheme. And so you may have seen this basically timeline before, but where the partnership at the moment is focused on people understanding in the land sector their number, so understand what your emissions are, and trying to work out some sort of pricing mechanism or identifying of opportunities to make change and some pricing mechanism. That's where we are right now. The government's just put out their consultation or response to the partnership agreement this last couple of weeks, so we'll touch on that in a minute. And then by 2025, if the recommendations are accepted, then there'll be a price on methane and some management of nitrous oxide as well and CO2. And then landowners will basically register in the system, calculate their emissions, identify options for reducing your emissions so you can reduce your levy, just like those other businesses are in the ETS. Basically, this price is trying to drive change in technology, and the same thing will happen with the levy, hopefully. That's the intent. So this is the levy at work. So the levy gets paid into an R&D fund to try and improve those technologies I was talking about so we can reach those targets. And that will be an ongoing program. So this way the partnership is quite similar to the ETS in terms of pricing of emissions, but where that money goes and how that sort of feeds back into the system is kind of what the difference is between the two. So in the ETS, there's a big long list of participants, predominantly, and they are cross-sector, so there are some agriculture related businesses in the ETS, and these are mainly related to either whether you're importing or manufacturing synthetic fertilisers. Some slaughtering facilities are included, dairy processing, and exporting live cattle. So these particular agricultural related activities are already included in the ETS. And then, of course, there's other like stationary energy, forestry. So if you've got deforestation, you'll be priced for that. But the predominant number of participants in the ETS are related to forestry activities. So this is the total number of participants as of the last month or so. So you can see that there's quite a range of businesses covered by the ETS, and you can get all this information off the EPA website, which I thought was quite interesting. The main point I wanted to make here is that there are already some agricultural sort of processing facilities covered, And that was one of the things that the government was looking at, whether or not those emissions from nitrous oxide stay at the processor level, which is what this is here. Okay, so forestry in the ETS. So many of you probably already know about the emissions trading scheme and these 2,500 participants, but effectively what these participants have is they have forest areas that meet the national forest definition, and this is what New Zealand's definition is. So this is what a forest is in terms of the ETS. So if you want to generate tonnes of CO2 equivalent, an NZU, to sell, you have to have an area that meets this criteria. That's what's included in the ETS. Stock exclusion from these areas is not specifically required in New Zealand. It is in other countries and in other programs, but not in New Zealand. And vegetation that doesn't meet this definition is not included. So if you have areas of vegetation on your farm, which a lot of people do around this region, that may not meet this definition, you can't include it in the ETS. Why? Well, because we really, in New Zealand at the moment, don't have enough detailed information to be confident in an estimate to sell as an NZU. That's effectively why. So this came up in the He Waka Eke Noa discussion, and we'll explore this a bit more, but because they have a different way of dealing with non-ETS vegetation. The government is actively trying to include other non-forest vegetation in the ETS, so we are trying to get better data so that we can, with confidence, include it. It's not excluded permanently, it's just at the moment we don't have the data to include it. So effectively those forests that have been established after 1989 are included as well, and like I said, those dates are dates from national policy positions. So if you plant areas, you can plant areas to qualify for the ETS, so you can actively go and regenerate or plant areas. And then you could also potentially include regen areas in the ETS, but it is difficult to demonstrate down here in low rainfall areas. It does take a bit of energy. It's not as simple as, say, if you've planted an area, but it can be done. It's just not as easy. And then there are also liabilities on the other side. So it's not all upside. If you deforest any pre-1990 land, then you'll be charged the price of NZU today. So there are rules around that. So yeah, just be careful about knocking down forests pre-1990. You also have a liability for deforesting post-1990 areas that you have registered in the ETS. So if you've registered land, you've received NZUs, and then you've decided to change the land use, you'll have to basically give those NZUs back. So either you've got them because you've held onto them, or you'll have to go to the market and buy new ones at the current price. So there are liabilities on the ETS too. So deforestation is not a temporary destocking. Deforestation is where you've changed the land use. So you've gone from forest to, say, pasture. If you've got a plantation and you've harvested it, that's not a deforestation event, especially if you replant it again. That's just a forest management event. Okay, so a deforestation is triggered by a land use change. So there were some exemptions, so and they're listed here. So you can, this one's particularly relevant around this region, around tree weed exemptions. So if you do get rid of, say, wilding pines, then you won't be charged for that. Yeah, and then some other stuff around like natural events as well. How we calculate it? Well, you do it in two ways. If you've got less than 100 hectares, it's pretty simple. There's a lookup table. You look at your type of forest you've got, how old it is, and then you get the carbon credits. Pretty much that's it. If you've got bigger than 100 hectares, you're going to have to go and measure. It's called the Forest Management FMA. I can't remember the actual FMA. I work in acronyms all the time, so I don't need to know the words. Yeah, so basically, if you've got over 100 hectares, you've got to go out and measure. So there's a cost there, right? So there's basically a trade-off between the cost to originate in bigger areas or stick to the 100 hectares because it's a bit cheaper. Yeah, so they're the two main ways that we calculate the carbon. And then you report it to the ministry, the MPI who manage the program, and then they they issue with the NZUs. So yeah, basically this is a bit more about the field measurement approach, which is the FMA. So yeah, basically the FMA is a really interesting document if you've got some time to read it. It just details exactly how you have to do those plots, how many plots you need. The MPI allocate those plots for you, so you don't have to decide where they are. They do all that for you. And yeah, you have to go out and measure the forest. So basically, these are some key things about how to sense check whether or not you're eligible or whether or not you would include areas in the ETS. So how big? So it has to be over a hectare. Remember I said that forest definition requirements, basically anything under a hectare is not a forest in New Zealand. It has to be at least 30 metres wide as well. And the reason why they have these areas is it's easier to pick it up on remote sensing, so they can track it. And that's predominantly one of the main reasons why countries specify these forest definitions. Also, you need to know what species it is. It needs to be capable of growing at least 5 metres tall. So you have to show that it can grow that tall in this area. If it's a tree that has to be in the place where they've been planted. And then, as we said before, sometimes regenerating bush can be included, but it is a little harder. So how do we assess these areas? This is a screenshot of Wanaka with what's called the Lucas data set. So New Zealand has a land use data set which you can use to initially assess your land. So it specifies these orange areas. These are areas that are considered woody grassland. So they could be looked at and say, is this actually a forest? Because maybe the remote sensing hasn't been able to pick it up yet. Is this a regenerating area that's now met the definition of forest? Then these bright green areas, these are I think they're post-89 forest. So this potentially is eligible, this post-89 forest. That wasn't a forest in 31st of December 1989. So it was grassland then or something else. Now it's a forest, so that would be eligible. All this other green area was there before 1990, so it's not eligible. It's not eligible under the ETS. So this is a quick way of just having a quick look and see what's eligible. And then once you've got that sort of base, you can go in and maybe it's quite interesting to go and look at this area or do I really want to include this? What's my land use plan for this area up here? So this is a quick fire way to understand what's happening on your land. So that's the ETS, He Waka Eke Noa. This is probably what you all came here for, right? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take a deep breath. This is what I know about He Waka Eke Noa. So it's a primary sector climate action partnership. It's supported by all of these groups, and they've been actively working over the last 3 years to try and put together some proposal that doesn't mean that agriculture gets put into the ETS. That's predominantly what it's about. It's not about whether or not methane's going to be charged. It's going to be charged, whether it's through He Waka Eke Noa or through the ETS. They're the two options. Not being charged for methane was not part of the discussion. So, reminder, this is New Zealand's pie graph. This whole section sits outside the ETS, as we said. This whole section is predominantly in the ETS if it's over a certain threshold of emissions. So as I said, He Waka Eke Noa is really about trying to find a workable alternative other than the ETS for encouraging reductions in methane from the ag sector. And the way that basically the policy settings are set is that encouragement needs to come from pricing of the pollutant, in this case, which is methane. So, as I said, there's a timeline where at the end of 2022, basically we're in the situation here where by the end of the year, we're hoping there'll be a clarity around whether or not He Waka Eke Noa has come up with an alternative to the ETS. I think they're close. and then with the aim that by 2025 that all farms will be part of the emission, basically being levied or either levied or in the ETS by this date. So at the moment, the platform or the framework is suggesting that basically all those farms that are over 80 hectares will be included in the pricing mechanism. There may be some smaller properties included if they are dairy farms with a milk supply number or they're cattle feedlots as well. So they could be less than the 80 hectares, but basically any farm over 80 hectares will be covered. So the preferred structure from He Waka Eke Noa is that it's an individual farm levy. So that means that each farm will be levied and that the levy can be basically influenced by the farmer. So how many emissions that you emit under your control, so that basically you can make your own farm level decisions about the cost and implications. The structure requests a split gas approach. So what that means is it's quite, no other country's doing this, is what I'll basically throw down. New Zealand's sort of gone out on its own here, so there's no other examples from which we can draw from. The industry wants this approach. They want to split methane from CO2 from nitrous oxide. So earlier I said about we all talk in tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's not going to happen under this program. He Waka Eke Noa does not want tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. It wants to treat those gases separately. So what that means predominantly is you can't compare them, and that means you also can't buy an NZU to offset your methane because they're different units. They're different. Okay, so a split gas approach. That means that these will be different units and there'll be different prices because they're different units. Complicated yet? Yeah. Okay. So it also requests that the farms calculate their emissions using a single model. So the government will specify the model, and the model will be pretty much consistent with most of you would have done some sort of calculation, I imagine, if you're a landowner here, from either the beef and lamb calculator or overseer or whatever other tool you've got. That all of those tools use a similar approach to the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. What the government is saying is that everyone has to use the same calculation approach, and so they'll specify that, which will be the same as the greenhouse gas inventory approach, right? So more or less. So each of those calculators will be slightly adjusted to make sure they're all reporting consistently. If you've tried to use a different calculator, you'll know that the numbers come up slightly differently, probably within 10% of each other. That's just because the models work slightly differently. What the government is saying, everyone will use the same calculator. So that's good news. And each of those frameworks will be able to just plug it onto their calculator or their model. You'll be able to, basically the levy will be per farm, so it won't be industry average or anything like that, it'll be your farm. Whatever your emissions are, that's your emissions and that's what you pay. So you're in full control of that. So that's quite unique actually across globally. Very few countries are doing it to that level. So basically you won't get national averages and you'll be rewarded for any positive action you take because you're not getting the average, you're actually getting your farm's emissions. Yep. So in any year, whatever you emit is what you pay, not what the average industry is emitting. Then finally, the preferred structure is that on-farm sequestration and vegetation is actually included. So this would mean that both basically forests and non-forests can generate, I'm going to call it revenues, okay? So under He Waka Eke Noa, the assumption is that if you have forests, you'll include it in the ETS. Yeah, but if you have non-forest vegetation, you will get a payment for that. It won't be in tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, it won't be in NZUs, it will be in cash to offset your cost of your levy. And they're going to value that somehow. as I said, they can't do it in NZU numbers or tons of carbon dioxide equivalent because we don't have good enough models for that yet. So it'll just be an economic value that is agreed for particular hectares. So you'd have to know the hectares of your non-forest vegetation and some sort of qualification of what type of vegetation it is, which He Waka Eke Noa is specified. So the government responded to this. The industry wanted to be able to set its own price for methane. I've got a shake of their head here. The rest of on the other side, on the ETS, the industry isn't, those industries aren't setting their price. So it was a little bit, I would say it's bold, like fair play, but it's a little bit, it would create a unfair situation, right? So the government is asking, basically, they're proposing that there's separate levy prices for different gases. They agree with that. So they're okay with the split gas approach. But basically they're saying that they'll set the price, not the industry. That the government would like to set the price. And I guess the other key thing is that the biogenic methane levy would have a unique price that is adjusted based on progress towards domestic methane targets. So what they're saying is they're going to reduce the price on methane if you reduce your emissions. If you don't reduce your emissions, the price will be higher to try and encourage you to reduce your emissions. That's what I was saying in the ETS. There's a price point where businesses at $90, $100 a tonne, they're going to look internally to reduce their emissions instead of going to buy an NZU because it's going to be cheaper for them to do that. And that's what the pricing mechanism will be here, the same sort of ETS type mindset that a higher levy will cause you to make change. We all, that's how humans operate, unfortunately. We're more of respond to sticks than we do to carrots, usually. Okay. What else did the government say? Well, in terms of what's reported and recognising sequestration, so the government's proposing that farmers report their farm area, their livestock numbers, as I said, livestock production and fertiliser use. These are the main data sources that will be collected by this calculation framework that they're going to specify. And then long term, the government would prefer that all vegetation be included in the ETS. Now, the reason for this is because it doesn't create any sort of grey areas usually. It's a lot more, it means that any credit, basically you generate NZUs, credits of the same unit, and they can be interchangeably used in the market. As soon as you start to have different sort of types of these, well, they're not even units, it's just payment, it becomes a bit more muddy in the water. Around what, it basically, there's multiple different types of vegetation and it just becomes harder. So they would prefer long term that everything goes into the ETS and is created as a tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, converted to a NZU that anyone could then use. That would be their preference. But at the moment they're going to have this time period because they recognise there's no, they want to be able to recognise vegetation that landowners are managing effectively. And you get some reward for that, but it won't be as a unit, it will be as, like I said, cash. It'll be as your hectares of this vegetation, you're protecting that, you're looking after that, we'll give you some, there is some economic value for that, we'll give you some money for that to offset your levy. And that's what the government's going to do in the short term. So it proposes this simple system that sits adjacent to the farm level pricing system and pays farmers and growers for this sequestration occurring in what they're terming both riparian vegetation and arising from management of indigenous vegetation. So the key detail around that is really not, like from my point of view, I want to go deeper and understand that more, but at the moment that's all we've got in terms of the terminology they're going to use. So the detail will come quite soon, but this is where we are right now. So riparian vegetation and managed indigenous vegetation has an economic value which will be paid to offset your levy. Yep. It won't be, basically you get paid and then you have to pay. The reason why we have to have these transactions is because they're not the same units. Yeah, that's because we've gone the split gas approach. It's apples and oranges at that point. It's not oranges and oranges. So that's why that complication sits there. So why are we doing this? So the reason why we're going down the levy is basically this is from the government website saying that it's trying to bolster New Zealand's reputation as a low emissions provider of agricultural products. I want you to dwell on that a little bit because I'm going to go further into that on the last slide. New Zealand is the only country setting up a regulatory system for pricing methane. But there are many organisations, large businesses, that are doing this as well, globally, that are basically driving change in other countries, not because of regulation, but because big buyers, want low emissions food. And so that is coming alongside the regulation in New Zealand. Yeah. I'm going to explore that a bit more, sorry. Okay, so and then recognition and support for farms that are already doing good work. Yep, so you'll be able to basically benchmark yourself based on your levy. I'm cleaner, I'm low emissions intensity, or I have lower overall emissions than the national average. And this is something that you guys can use in terms of part of your marketing of your products. And then finally, the main thing here from a taxpayer point of view, if you want to move yourself out of as a primary producer into the role of a taxpayer, it's going to avoid the significant cost of abatement for any emissions above our national determined contribution. So New Zealand have made that 50% reduction commitment by 2030. If we do not hit that national determined contribution, it is going to cost every single one of us in this room. Also, it is going to cost us in trade because we've just now signed a European Union trade agreement which links our trade with the European Union to us achieving our NDC. If we don't achieve our NDC, they stop trading. If they don't receive their NDC, we stop trading. Yep. We have to meet the NDC. Okay. So that NDC, reminder, is 50% reduction by 2030. And the government is asking the ag sector to reduce their emissions by 10% in that time frame so that we can help that. And if we do that, we will meet our NDC as long as everyone else in the ETS does their job too. Okay, so the government intends to build this basic calculator. Farmers can reduce their levy by breeding for low emission methane animals, breeding basically feeding methane reducing supplements, or administering methane suppressants. All these things are possible now. Okay, so Bovera basically is a methane suppressant that is available on the market now. It reduces methane in livestock by somewhere between 30 and 40%. And it's basically been approved in Brazil, about to be approved in EU. I heard by December in Australia, but yet to happen, I think. This exists right now. It's basically 12 years in the making. Very, very effective in situations like dairies where you've got more daily contact with your livestock. In more extensive situations, less useful. But yeah, this will help the dairy sector, which, if you remember on the first slide, they are the major source of methane in New Zealand. So these all things, we don't have to wait necessarily for a vaccine. This actually exists now. Okay, so there are things you can actively do on your farm. Felicity and I have been running these courses in Australia because Rabobank, they've made a commitment for all of their farmers to be, I think it's net zero, isn't it? Net zero investment. So Rabobank is saying, across our whole investment portfolio, we want our investment to be only funding net zero activities. Rabobank's one of the largest financiers of ag sector globally. They've got a big job to do, right, if that's going to be achieved. So they're asking every single farmer that they are part of their investment portfolio in Australia to do their emissions, just like they're asking them here. They want to, as a portfolio, to be net zero. They're asking all those landowners to contribute to their net zero, and they're going to go back to them and say, show me what you're doing in an action plan to reduce your emissions to get the finance. So it's just, like I was saying, that it's not necessarily only driven by governments. This has been driven by finance sector and marketing sector as well in other countries. So to offset the levy, you'll either have to register your He Waka Eke Noa vegetation, and that will give you some revenue to offset your levy, or you plant any sort of land that you've got around and register in the ETS, originate NZUs and sell them, and then generate revenue to pay your levy. Now, the reason why you can't net at your gate is because of the split gas. You can't net it. You have to go through the transaction of generating the income to pay the levy. That's the transaction cost. So what's the pricing look like? Well, this is out of the He Waka Eke Noa, basically the latest document that went to the government for their comment. So for methane, they're looking at there's 3 different prices here. So the levy between this period of time to 2025 to 2029 is 11 cents per unit, and then going up to either 17% or 17 cents or 35 cents. They were the 2 modelling scenarios. And this will depend, like I say, on how much reduction is actually happening. So if there's not a lot of reduction happening, they're going to price it at the higher price. If we're getting close to our 10% reduction target, then they'll price it at the lower price. And then for the longer-lived gases, which are nitrous oxide and CO2, it's higher. It's $4.25 and $13.18. They're not changing this, mainly because there's less. Well, they're not as important to reduce as the methane is, really, in terms of total emissions. So this is what the pricing actually looks like at the moment. And then for sequestration, we haven't got real prices for this yet, and we're hesitant to put them up, but basically what the key thing on this slide is the 3 different types of categories. So they're looking at indigenous vegetation established before 2008, indigenous vegetation after that date, and then riparian veg after 2008. So they're the key criteria, the dates and the type of veg that they're going to put a price on, basically. So understanding what these are on your farm right now would be a good plan. So what do you do? So we've been helping some local farmers understand what this means for them. This particular scenario here, just to give you some idea, it's about this sort of scale. We did some different modelling, but we've just put this particular one up to say that if this particular farm planted around 65 hectares of exotic hardwood, so they're planting like oaks and a whole lot of other exotic sort of hardwood type veg, sort of almost like, basically not for timber production or anything else, just for permanent forest cover. And we made the assumption that the stocking rate stays about the same, so there's no increase in stocking. And we did the modelling based on the current price of the day, which was $86 a tonne for an NZU. What that meant was this particular farm had about 5,000 tonnes of methane. No, CO2 equivalents. So their total emissions were 5,000 tonnes. So I'm looking at Felicity because she did all the hard work here. I'm just presenting it. Yeah, so basically what we ended up with, if you put in all the establishment costs, these negative numbers for these 65 hectares, and we planted out to 20, we don't plant it all in 1 year, we planted out over 4 years, which was what this particular farm was planning to do. Basically, if you project out to 2032, which is where we could project to because of those pricing numbers that we know, those 11 cents and the 17 or 35, you can see out to that period of time, if that farm plants 65 hectares of its 1,800, they're actually in a net positive scenario, having paid their levy. So their levy starts off at $22,000 and then flips into here $42,000. But this is the net revenue from that you receive only at basically just assuming $86 a tonne from that planted 65 hectares in the ETS. And so they're actually able to achieve a net positive situation there after paying their levy. Yep, cool. So, as I was saying, it's good to understand. This is a really good exercise for that particular farm. They were planning on planting this to put in the ETS, and then we were able to confirm with this pricing structure that actually there'll be basically there'll be a net benefit for them beyond the levy, that they can then use that money for other things like potentially even reducing their methane further by basically putting in Bovera or looking at those other options that are available in terms of feed supplements as well. So I guess from what we've learned and working with this, we've done a similar exercise with a dairy as well, looking at planting in between the centre pivots. Same sort of scenario. They were able to pretty much get to a net positive situation as well. So basically, it's really good to understand right now, like what areas you have, both for ETS and for He Waka Eke Noa, and basically understand that go through that process of understanding what your real risk and liabilities might be. And so what we've recommended is people, pretty much everyone knows their number now. That's useful. Then you also should, in combination with that, understand what's happening in terms of how you can offset that number. Model that number right through to the levy at 11 cents, and then understand what your vegetation, where you're going to put it. Is it vegetation for He Waka Eke Noa, or is there some areas that I can actually put in the ETS, or am I going to plant some areas to go into the ETS? And then also understand what's available for you now to reduce your methane. So reducing and trying stuff now is not going to impact your levy in the future. There's no baseline here. Okay, so whatever you do today, you'll be rewarded for in the future because it's annual accounting. No one cares what you did the year before. They only care what you did in the year of the emissions. Yeah, so this is annual accounting of your emissions. Whatever you do today doesn't impact your levy in the future, only if you do good things. If you're testing feed supplements, if you're planting land, all of those credits will add up, all of that sequestration will be starting to hit its straps in 2025 when the levy comes in. If you plant today, it'll be growing fast in 2025, or faster than it would be if you waited till 2025. And so it's what's happening in that year. It's annual accounting. Yep. So you shouldn't wait, is what I'm trying to say. Whatever you do now, you're going to practice and learn and be ready for 2025. And then, it's also important to know it's not all about carbon. So when you're thinking about what you're doing, you basically got to put that in your whole farm system. And that's what that's what I think primary producers are super good at, actually, is that you understand the land better than policymakers. You can understand more clearly how this interacts with the rest of your business. Yeah, so thinking about how it's going to fit in with your business is the main, is the approach, I think, the position from which to come from when you're looking at how to respond. So, integrate all those decision making into like a broader farm plan is how you I guess move forward in this space a bit. Finally, this is a slide that we present to farmers in Australia when we're trying to explain, because for them, we've been doing these courses for the last 12 months with University of Melbourne, and they haven't got an emerging regulation. They've just got this space of people telling them they need to be better, okay? And the reason why we show this slide to try and explain where it's coming from. So each one of these companies have put forward targets. So I mentioned Paris Agreement, all countries put forward a target. Pretty much every major organisation, corporation in the world has also put forward a target. So a lot of you, these are all only businesses related to the ag sector or food production. Each one of these has their target and they're as ambitious as countries. So, Rabobank, which I mentioned, they're down here. So they want net zero financed emissions by 2050. NAB the same. So they basically they hold 50% of agri debt in Australia. So they're a big player in this space in Australia. They're really driving it hard. And it's important to also note that of the 100 largest economies, 69 of them are actually companies. So those companies are as big as countries, and they're driving much more of this than necessarily regulation. Like, big businesses have the same commitments as the New Zealand government, and they are demanding their supply chain respond. That's what's happening right now. So what these companies are saying is as important as what New Zealand's saying. So these companies have wide reach. So beyond New Zealand, most countries who have an active ag export sector will have to respond to these companies' demands for lower emissions products as well. So even though the country may not have a policy on ag, their supply chains do. That's the main point here. The stars mean that these companies have actually committed to increasing plant-based protein as well as part of their response to try and meet these targets. That's just as for interest sake here as well. So alongside these zero environmental impact in our operations, which Nestle have said, they're also committed to increasing plant-based protein in their products, along with Unilever, Kellogg's. Interestingly, Unilever are footprinting all of their products. So we'll start to see carbon footprints on food products pretty soon. Every single product manufactured by Unilever is going to have an emissions intensity report, like basic report card, just like you'd see a heart tick or whatever that we're used to seeing. So that means that every single person putting food into their supply chain needs to know their emissions, needs to know their footprint. They're going to ask it for it. Cool. Have I gone over time? Yeah. So I was going to get Felicity. Felicity's got the, Felicity's going to do that. So, cool, thanks. Welcome, Felicity. So this is Felicity. Felicity works with me. Do you want to introduce yourself, Felicity?
Briefly, I'll try not to run too much more over time, but I have come from a sheep and beef farm in the North Island, in the Wairarapa, but I did a PhD in engineering and have moved more and more into the climate space over my professional career, and now I work here in Hawea and basically try and bridge the gap between science and what's happening in the greenhouse gas space and everyday people who want to know more and make change. So yeah, I'm very lucky to work in that space. And we've only got 3 questions so far, which is good because hopefully no one's got other commitments to get to. Number 1 being, what are the impacts of there being no emissions cap in the He Waka Eke Noa framework? Can't the sector then just buy its way out of meaningful change?
Yeah, good question. So there's no cap in the ETS as well. So the ETS operates without a cap. So it's consistent with how the government has set up the pricing mechanism. It is, yeah, so sure, people can basically, let me start again, rewind. So if the sector is willing to pay for the levy, then sure, the emissions won't go down. Okay, so you accept the levy, you pay it, and your emissions stay the same. But presumably it'll get to the price, and if that happens, then by 2030, the emissions haven't gone down, the price is going to go up. So it'll go up to 35 cents. That's going to be nearly 3 times what the price is initially. Okay, so that'll start to hurt, I suppose. And then, so when things start to hurt, you'll basically look for alternatives to try and reduce. So you'll either go to the market and buy an NZU, an offset, or you'll make internal reductions. The government doesn't really mind, I don't think, if you buy an NZU, if there's enough of them, because those credits keep removing CO2 from the atmosphere anyway. So you know, that's basically not a bad thing. But it is a risk, I guess, with emissions trading schemes that emissions don't actually go down. But presumably the price will get to the point where you'll have to make some change and emissions will decline. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those prices that were up there are just, they're not the set prices yet, but they are the modelled price to generate change. So basically those prices in the He Waka Eke Noa recommendation were the sort of prices they thought they could set to see about 4 to 5% reduction in methane based on those numbers, depending on the technology that was available at the time. So the idea is the pricing drives the change, and it's the same with the way that we'll see the NZU price increasing over time to try and basically pass that cost on to try drive behaviour change, because that's how
I mean, we're definitely seeing at around $100 internally you start to reduce your emissions rather than buy an offset.
And the next question is, carbon offsets are only good until trees are, say, 50 years old. Doesn't this imply an eventual substantial reduction in stock numbers? It's basically, what I would say is that obviously the way that we're approaching our targets is planting more trees, and then we're going to see a eventual decline in the sequestration that they can achieve. But in that time, ideally, we're achieving reductions in methanes through increased technology such as feed additives. But
yeah. So offsets are quite controversial, I think, generally speaking. Like people, they have a role in this space. I mean, it's really important to recognise both emissions and sequestration. The overall intent, though, is, you know, there's a sweet spot here where we obviously don't want to put all of our agricultural land into trees, and we don't want, and we want to be able to produce food. So, you know, there's a yes, it's designed not necessarily. We don't need to be necessarily zero. We just need to reduce emissions by 10%, and so that's the main focus. Offsets have a role to play, or sequestration has a role to play in balancing the system, but the idea is that you actually price emissions so that you reduce your overall emissions over time.
And I guess it's giving time to act as well. So while we may be able to plant trees tomorrow and generate some sequestration of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, ideally in 10 years' time we'll be able to reduce methane from livestock with feed additives by 30 to 40%, or vaccines by higher, or early life programming, or all of the other technology that's being trialled and trying to implement, because to have livestock production as a food source, addressing the methane is really the only way to have that as a sustainable food source, basically. And I think we've got one last question, which is your favourite question. You're going to really enjoy this one. Is well-managed pasture included in rewards as it sequesters carbon?
Yeah, thanks for that one. So soil carbon increases under well-managed pasture. That's well documented. When you have well-managed pasture, you have high productivity. That's also well known. In New Zealand, we have quite high carbon stocks already in our soils, relatively speaking, to, say, other countries. So it's actually the increase in soil carbon that would be recognised as it's kind of like the increase of growth in a tree. We don't credit trees sitting there. We credit trees that are growing. If your soil carbon is sitting there doing its thing, helping you be more productive, it's not growing, then it doesn't get it's not credited. It's the change that we care about. So well-managed pastures. I mean, in New Zealand, we aren't including soil carbon in the calculations. Is how I would. But you can add, because I know you also enjoy this question.
I mean, it's a risk thing for the situation as well, because considering the graph or the infographic Carly showed at the start, where you're going to see an increase in drought or an increase in heavy rainfall, that's likely going to lead to, not by any of your, as a landowner, it's not necessarily your fault, not necessarily what you can control, but you are going to potentially see a loss of soil carbon in those events. So it's whether you want to be paying for those soil carbon loss events as well as being rewarded for those soil carbon growth events. And in the New Zealand context, you're probably putting yourself at a lot more risk of having to pay more often than you're actually going to see a reward there. So you can't just have it one way. You can't necessarily just receive a reward when things are going well and not include those as an emissions when things aren't going so well. And as the climate continues to change, it's maybe more likely one way than the other. So yeah, I think considering the risk that comes with including something like soil carbon is worth considering when you want that drive for that reward.
And just to add a little more global context to that, there's two major countries focused on soil carbon at the moment, one the US, the other one Australia. If we look to both those countries for like examples of success, there aren't many. So in Australia there's close to, 1,700 tonnes have been credited across 100 and nearly
600 projects.
Yeah, 600 projects
And
across
it's one
Australia.
project.
And those 1,700 tonnes have come from one project. So at the moment, we could say there's a delay because of the monitoring and modelling methodology. But it's very difficult to, one, show change in soil carbon over short periods of time, and to hold on to it in a changing climate. And Australia would be one example where, I know in my own town this week it's all under flood. So like the largest flood on record. Most of not all my family, but a lot of them are underwater. That soil carbon is gone, like it's washed away. So and then you go further into the northwest of New South Wales, the last 4 years of drought, those guys haven't been able to show a change in soil carbon, and they're lucky to hold on to it. So the key thing is if it's going down, you're paying. If it's going up, you're getting paid. If it's staying stable, you're winning. Yeah, because you're holding your productivity, you're able to respond to a changing climate, and you haven't got the risk of having to pay back, getting paid a tonne of CO2 in Australia at the moment, $17, and the projections are go to 30. You could get paid $17 this year, and in 5 years' time have to pay it back, find it somewhere for 30. So I don't know. I'd be just thinking about all of the pros and cons when you're looking at soil carbon. In the US, it's the similar situation. There are some more credited projects, but a lot of them have a lot of controversy around them. Have been able to show holding on to that carbon for long periods of time is hard in a changing climate. Yes, Jim. I'll take one from the floor.
Thanks, Carly. Okay. Well, firstly, excellent talk. Now, going to the biochemistry. So, as I understand it, methanogenic bacteria rob the animals of energy. So that's more a statement rather than a question. But the question is, I believe Finn from Lake Worth Station was investigating the role of seaweed in reducing methogenic bacteria in the gut. Do you know if he's found good news or what on that?
I can't speak specifically to Finn, and Finn's in the back. I can talk a little bit about what the current science that we've been presenting out of Melbourne Uni is, and that seaweed does have a role to play in suppressing methanogens in the rumen. But one of the key things, and probably Finn can have a response as well, is that it does show a lot of promise. The key thing will be about bromoform, which is basically a byproduct of the processing of seaweed, and that's it's an ozone depletant. So just trying to understand all of the sort of environmental knock-on effects, but yeah, for sure, it's one of the feed additives that is showing some promise. Did you want to add anything, Finn?
Just quickly, I know Fonterra's doing a trial. We're hoping to do a trial shortly with Sea Forest, the Australian company, on Asparagopsis, which is the methane-reducing seaweed. But still a couple of years away, I think, before they've got scale. The key thing is getting scale of production for the seaweed. And then just quickly on the bromoform, there's a new modelling paper that's just come out that said, even if we fed sort of all the world's cattle on Asparagopsis, that I think ozone depletion is around 3% of the global ozone depletion. So it's an effect, but it's possibly not super significant at scale. Yeah, but it's still a couple of years away. And I think, as Carly mentioned, there's possibly more exciting or cheaper, well, more so cheaper synthetic reducers. Like there's another one, Moo Trail, that's coming to New Zealand as well, that might just be cheaper than Asparagopsis, which we'll go for. Yeah.
There's definitely quite a lot of progress in the last decade anyway on feed supplements and suppressants. So yeah, it's promising. I've got one. Oh yeah. If anyone has to go, don't feel rude. You can actually leave because I know we're over. There you go.
Thanks, Carly. This is just a calculation question when you're putting in place methane suppressants and things. At the moment, or at the start, the input to the calculation is just a stock number. How do you calculate for the reduction through those means?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Annabelle, because I said that the government's going to put forward the calculation procedure, and at the moment we've got pretty, I would say not dumb, but pretty basic emission factors. So what will be the key here for on-farm recognition of change? Or do we get better emission factors for feeding these supplements? Which won't be too hard. The research has been saying the research is coming along really fast, so we'll be able to get pretty good emission factors for if you say feeding, basically the feeding Bovera, Moo Trail, Asparagopsis, other things that are moving from research into operation. Then that's when we get an emission factor for that, and that'll be incorporated into the Excel. Well, sorry, the calculation framework. God help, it's not Excel. Yep, one question here.
Thanks, Carly. Is there talk on the latest science of GWP star being discussed, being a flow gas and not a cumulative biogenic methane as part of a larger carbon cycle? Why is that not being discussed? There are mentions of it in the IPCC, that it overstates the warming of methane 3 to 4 times. So why is that not being talked about when over 60 scientists worked on this?
Yeah, so GWP star has been considered quite a lot. It's not that it hasn't been discussed. For those of you who don't know about GWP star, so when we talked about methane and the different gases, each gas has a different global warming potential. So each gas has different ability to trap that radiative heat that I was talking about. So methane is quite effective at trapping heat. In fact, it's 27 times more effective than, say, CO2. So that's over a 100-year time frame. So when we're talking about different gases, we tend to use this 100-year time frame. It just makes it basically because you then can start compare apples with apples, basically. GWP star, just for interest's sake, nitrous oxide is even more effective. It's 297, 273. It keeps changing because the science keeps getting better, and also the atmosphere concentrations change, so which also changes the gases. That's why it keeps changing. So basically nitrous oxide is 273 times more effective at trapping heat than CO2. So GWP star came into the frame because, as I said, we'll look at it over a 100-year time frame, but methane only lives in the atmosphere, does it live? It's a gas. It basically breaks down, each gas breaks down. It breaks down in around 12 years. It breaks down into other gases. Okay, so it breaks down from methane into other gases, some of them also having global warming impact, right? So it doesn't disappear, it just changes its form from methane into something else, okay? So GWP star came about because countries where, like New Zealand, who have high emissions from methane, were interested in recognising the fact that the gas only stays in the atmosphere for 12 years, not for 100, when in fact So basically this concept changes that global warming potential from 27, it actually makes it bigger. It makes it, I forget what the global warming potential GWP star number is, but yeah, changes it to 84, right? So it goes from 27 to 84. So you're multiplying every molecule of CH4 instead by 27, you're multiplying it by 84, and then it goes down over time. I'm going to get Felicity in there though to explain. Basically, GWP star works where you've got livestock numbers that are either declining, it works in your favour. If you've got livestock numbers that are increasing, it doesn't work in your favour. So it's depends on that, and the reason why that GWP star hasn't sort of taken on as a global way of accounting is because it benefits some countries and disadvantages others. And so that's why GWP star hasn't necessarily got the traction in the accounting world at the moment at a national level. But as a science, yes, it's more accurately reflects, I guess, the way methane responds in the atmosphere. But to actually calibrate that model, you have to have 20 years of data, historical data, to actually calibrate the model to run it. So not every farm necessarily would have all of that 20 years worth of data to be able to calibrate the model to then make it, realistically run. So it's scientific. It's got a very strong scientific basis, but the practical implementation of it is just not isn't seen as feasible at this point. Because basically every farm would have to have 20 years historical data to be able to run GWP star through the calculator, if you want to just put that as the base. And then, if you increase your stock numbers, you're going to be affected by that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, thanks. I guess I'm just questioning the cycle, because during that cycle, those hydrocarbons, where do they then go to in a pastured farming operation? Those are cycled back through growing pasture to the animal and round again. This is not really recognised.
It is recognised in the science. It's more, we only take a look at, it is recognised in the carbon cycle. We do include that in all of those calculations that we're working on. It's part of the carbon cycle. It's about how the farming system removes CO2 from the atmosphere, converts it basically into methane or nitrous oxide through the process of generating either food, like meat or fibre in livestock system, and then how that cycles back through both the carbon, nitrogen cycle. That's all included in all those emission factors that we actually use. So it is included, just possibly not communicated as well as it could be, is probably what I would say.
That's not an active discussion, and it's you're thinking about someone who's farming like Mark, and doing that whole cycle, and then suddenly you're feeling quite victimised because that's not being talked about, I guess.
So I think I've just got a new topic for my next talk next year, is about how those, because that's how the emission factors are actually set up. So all of that research that goes into those simple emission factors considers the cycling through the carbon, the nitrogen cycle. And then that also influences some of the decisions we make about whether or not we include soil carbon or not. Because depending on where we are and what sort of farming system we have, basically the transaction cost may be too high to actually even, try and account for that small change. I know it's over a large area, but it probably doesn't make up as much of, we probably should be focusing our energy on methane reduction, because that's where 90% of our emissions are. Yeah. Quick, Jim.
Yep, this will be quick. Now, within the IPCC community, Martin Manning and Tom Wigley have weighed in very vociferously that GWP star is a false concept. So that may disappear because of these issues. So in fact, GWP star should not be used. It's proposed by a person at VUW, and he's not the greatest methane expert.
I think that's the beauty of IPCC in some ways. You know, we allow these, well, not allow, that's really wrong. We listen, we investigate, we consider all these things. And then we put that in the context of how can this actually practically work on a farm scale or on a country scale. And then we create an accounting framework that pretty much does the best it can do without causing people too much pain of trying to collect all that data. Because ultimately what we want to do is we want to take those numbers, understand them enough to make an action to change. Do you need to know exactly, you know, the full molecular change through everything to actually make a change? I don't think so. I think if we can get where's the key thing we need to do and how do we do it, that's kind of what the IPCC tries to achieve, based on science but not the nitty-gritty. I've got one more and then we'll have to wrap up, I think.
I'm a very old farmer, well retired, but I just want to make an observation on my farm in terms of carbon sequestration. And that was really about every 15 years when I started farming, we would have to lift our bottom wire on our fence about 2 inches. Now, it seems extraordinary to me that there seems to be no calculation for the benefits that farmers produce by growing grass, photosynthesizing carbon dioxide, and it just seems completely dumb for New Zealand, and we grow grass brilliantly compared with the rest of the world, and I think that's why the comparison between New Zealand and Australia and the USA in terms of this cycle is an erroneous calculation. I think, just in my observation as a non-scientist, about every 15 years we had to lift our bottom wire 2 inches. Now that must tell you we are putting a lot of carbon into our soil. Your comments, please.
Sure, I'll take that one. I've got a slide on why we don't include pasture as a carbon stock, which I can flip through. Maybe I'll try and do that. I don't deny that managing your pasture well leads to better soil carbon. That's true, 100% true. Do we need to credit that in this environment is the question that you really need to ask yourself. And that's the question most people are trying to, basically most people who are exploring soil carbon as a mitigation option have to ask themselves. You have to store that soil carbon for 100 years to get credited for it, and generally, I mean, in Australia they reduce it to 25, in the US it's like 50 depending on the program, but you need to be able to show that that soil carbon has increased and stayed there for that period of time. If you can do that, then it's a creditable activity in a voluntary market. In New Zealand, for the regulatory market, basically you need to measure, you have to consider the cost of measuring it as well. So it's not enough to say we lifted the wire so therefore it's increased. You have to actually measure it. You have to actually go out and measure it, because basically just like with the livestock, we've spent all this energy trying to get emission factors for different livestock, because I'm sure a beef farmer or a sheep farmer is not going to accept a dairy farmer's emission factor. You know, you're going to want emission factors that are specific to your business. So we don't have the data in New Zealand, and most countries don't, to actually show the increases in soil carbon using an emission factor. So you'll have to go out and measure it. And that's the one of the reasons why, you know, soil carbon credits are hard to originate, because it's costly. And then you've got to show that that's staying there through time or increasing through time. So you have to remeasure it on a regular basis. So the reason why we don't credit grass is because basically grass, you grow grass and then the cows or livestock that you have eat the grass. So they're turning that carbon that you've sequestered in your grass actually into methane. And as I said earlier, CO2 has a global warming potential of 1 and methane has a global warming potential of 27. So you're actually converting CO2 to methane. They're actually like little mini landfills, each one of those animals.
Is that a one-for-one calculation?
Well, it basically, it's the emission factor depends on the feed that you're feeding them and the livestock that you have. So each livestock has a different ability to convert that CO2 to methane. I can get you the emission factors if you like, but it depends on, I know a lot, but I don't store all that information. I rely on my book to tell me. I can't keep all that in my head. But you can get the emission factors from if you look in the back of basically all those calculators have all of the emission factors. So it's part of that cycle that I was talking about, the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. You're basically converting CO2 into methane. That's what that process is. So there's two parts. One, yes, good pasture management makes good sense. It makes good farming sense. All of you know that already. Do you need to get credited for that? That's a question you have to ask yourself. In the New Zealand He Waka Eke Noa framework, soil carbon's not currently part of the calculation framework. Can you create a voluntary carbon project in New Zealand on soil carbon? There isn't any examples of one yet, but there's no real reason why you couldn't. Well, there are a few reasons why you can't, but not insurmountable. Other countries are doing it, yes, but with not a lot of evidence at this stage of success, is what I'm going to say, at scale. So keep watching this space. There are lots of methodologies out there, lots of activity out there on this space. I'm not saying it's not possible, it's just not going to suit every farmer. It's not for everyone. Yep.
I just feel like we're slightly missing a trick here, because if you're encouraging farmers to have longer pasture, then we're going to reduce our potential for drought, potential for flooding, which are the things we talked about earlier. The grass, when it's grazed, is then going to pump that carbon down into the soil where it's stored, whereas you were talking before about a tree only has, however many, 30 years, and then the carbon's done, it's stored in the wood rather than in the soil. So by building topsoil, by managing these pastures, we're not only reducing drought, reducing potential flooding, we can lock up that carbon in the soil and feed the microbes and all that and become part of that cycle. I'm just thinking it's just missing a trick in that, by encouraging farmers to not have bare soil, to stop tilling, to stop ploughing and stuff, we could actually potentially, I just think there's a little section.
But if it already has all those benefits, why wouldn't you do it anyway? Do you know what I mean? Do you need to be paid a carbon credit for that, or a carbon price for that?
It's just about incentivizing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that would be the only enough incentive, though, would it? I mean, all those other incentives you just mentioned. One more.
Oh, just to really quickly respond to that, I'm been part of a project working on a voluntary soil carbon methodology in New Zealand, and the key thing is, it's a good thing to restore, I think, but the cost of measurement can be far more significant than any returns you get. You could spend $15,000 trying to measure soil carbon on a farm, and only get $5,000 return, as some examples we've looked at. So until we've got really cheap, accurate measurement tools, I think that's the key roadblock. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the biggest barrier. Costs to get. It's the transaction costs, which is but you should do it anyway, because there's other environmental benefits that you get financial benefit from. That makes more sense to me than that.
Carly,
Thank you.
if you come up the front, 'cause I'd love to thank you for this. I think it's absolutely remarkable that this is such a complex subject that we've retained probably 80% of the audience for 1.5 times the length of the original discussion.
I'm sorry.
No, it's no need to apologise, Carly. You've engaged people, and I think we've all learnt a lot. In the rural sector, it is a very difficult prospect for farmers to face, that they've actually got to do this. I'd just like to reflect that the rest of society is also doing it. You're seeing the cost across the whole of society. The cost of not doing it in the long-term future is huge. I'm not going to be here by 2100, but my children and my grandchildren are. And I think we have to look to the future in terms of actually doing the best we can across the whole of the country, not just the rural area as well. But some contribution from the rural area is going to be greatly appreciated by the rest of New Zealand. And I think it's going to be also in the long term probably improve the way we actually do our agriculture in terms of the management of the land and the amount of pollution that we're causing. I'm not just talking about carbon sequestration, I'm talking about the whole industry. I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd certainly like to thank Carly for a very engaging talk and for doing so well with the questions as well. Thank you very much, Carly.
Thank you. Thank you to you as well. Thank you.
These talks. Thank you.